The moment exists before anything visibly happens, stretched thin by expectation and memory rather than action. A crowd stands gathered, not unified by purpose but by shared anticipation, an unspoken agreement that something punitive is about to unfold. Their bodies are close, yet each person is isolated within their own fear, shaped by years in which public gatherings rarely ended without consequence. Wartime has trained them to read silence as warning and stillness as the prelude to violence. The air carries a density that cannot be explained by weather or numbers alone. It is the weight of history pressing down on the present. This expectation of revenge does not arise from rumor alone. It is rooted in precedent. In occupied lands and contested territories, crowds have learned that power announces itself loudly and brutally. Retaliation has often followed resistance, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. Entire communities have paid for the actions of a few, and sometimes for nothing at all. The people here know this pattern intimately. They have watched it repeat often enough to believe it inevitable. To them, revenge is not an emotional reaction but a procedural step, something authorities do to reassert control and remind the powerless of their place. Fear has become habitual, almost functional. It sharpens attention, governs posture, and dictates silence. Faces are carefully neutral, expressions flattened to avoid standing out. No one wants to be remembered later as the one who looked defiant, or worse, relieved. The crowd understands that survival often depends on blending into the collective, becoming indistinguishable, unremarkable. Individual identity dissolves in moments like this, replaced by a shared instinct to endure whatever comes next with minimal loss. The title's framing of "expecting revenge" captures more than an emotional state. It describes a worldview shaped by prolonged conflict. Revenge is assumed because justice has long ceased to feel impartial. Authority, especially foreign authority, is perceived as reactive and unforgiving. The crowd does not expect explanation, due process, or proportionality. They expect a demonstration. Revenge, in this sense, is theater, a public act meant to instill fear and discourage future transgressions. The crowd prepares itself not for understanding, but for spectacle. This preparation is physical as well as psychological. Shoulders hunch slightly, as if bracing against impact. People position themselves instinctively, some edging closer to perceived exits, others pressing inward to avoid being singled out. Parents are acutely aware of where their children stand. Elderly figures remain rigid, conserving energy, aware that sudden movement can attract attention. Even breathing becomes controlled, shallow, deliberate. The body adapts to fear long before the mind has time to articulate it. Time behaves differently in these moments. Seconds stretch, filled with internal calculations and remembered warnings. Each individual carries their own catalog of past scenes: a square emptied by gunfire, a neighbor taken away, a warning delivered too late. These memories overlap and reinforce one another, creating a collective anticipation that feels almost prophetic. The crowd is not guessing what will happen, they believe they already know, because history has taught them to expect the worst. Yet beneath this expectation lies something more corrosive than fear: resignation. Many in the crowd no longer hope to influence the outcome. They have learned that innocence does not guarantee safety, and compliance does not always prevent punishment. This resignation does not eliminate fear, but it dulls resistance. It convinces people that endurance, rather than opposition, is the most rational response. In this way, the expectation of revenge becomes a tool of control even before any action is taken. The moral landscape of the moment is already distorted. Revenge is anticipated not because the crowd believes it is deserved, but because they believe it is customary. The concept of justice has been eroded by repetition, replaced by an understanding that power acts according to its own logic. This erosion affects how people judge themselves as well. Some in the crowd quietly wonder if collective punishment is inevitable because suffering has become normalized, almost justified by its frequency. Guilt and innocence blur when fear becomes the dominant moral force. The environment itself seems complicit in this tension. Buildings loom as silent witnesses, their facades scarred or intact depending on luck rather than virtue. Streets that once hosted ordinary commerce now feel like corridors of judgment. Even familiar landmarks offer no comfort, having been repurposed by war into sites of surveillance, control, or memory. The crowd stands in a place that once belonged to daily life, now transformed into a stage for authority. What is striking is how little needs to be said for all of this to be understood. No announcement has been made. No accusation has been formally issued. And yet the expectation of revenge feels logical, almost reasonable. This is the psychological triumph of prolonged conflict. It teaches people to anticipate their own punishment. Fear becomes predictive, filling in gaps before reality has a chance to contradict it. In this opening moment, the crowd's greatest enemy is not the unseen authority approaching, but the certainty they have built around its intentions. They are already reacting to something that has not yet occurred. This anticipation shapes their behavior more effectively than any shouted order could. It keeps them still, compliant, and inwardly divided. The stillness, however, is not peaceful. It is tense, brittle, ready to fracture at the slightest provocation. Every person senses that whatever happens next will confirm or challenge everything they believe about power and survival. The expectation of revenge hangs over them like a verdict already passed, awaiting only its execution. And in that suspended moment, before footsteps are heard and before assumptions are tested, the crowd reveals the true cost of war, not only in lives lost, but in minds trained to expect cruelty as the natural order of events. The sound arrives before it can be clearly identified, a disturbance in the thick silence that causes the entire crowd to stiffen. It is not loud, not dramatic, but it carries a clarity that cuts through every private thought at once. Footsteps. The recognition is immediate and instinctive, shaped by countless past moments when such a sound marked the beginning of something irreversible. The crowd does not need to see who is approaching. The rhythm alone is enough to trigger a collective reaction. Muscles tighten, spines straighten, and the shared anticipation sharpens into near certainty. These footsteps feel deliberate, measured, neither hurried nor hesitant. That steadiness makes them more unnerving. In wartime memory, chaos often precedes violence, but order can signal authority at its most confident. The crowd reads the sound not merely as movement, but as intention. Each step seems to claim space, to assert control over the ground it touches. The people listening cannot help but imagine boots, uniforms, weapons, even before any of these are visible. Sound becomes image in their minds, shaped by fear and repetition. The flinch that moves through the crowd is subtle yet unmistakable. It is not a sudden scattering or a cry of alarm, but a synchronized tightening, a small inward collapse shared by dozens of bodies at once. Heads dip almost imperceptibly. Shoulders rise. Hands clench or press against pockets and coats as if anchoring themselves. This reaction is not conscious. It is reflex, honed by experience. The body remembers what the mind wishes it could forget. For some, the footsteps revive very specific memories. A knock at the door in the early hours. The sound of boots on stairs. The measured approach of authority that offers no escape because it does not rush. Those memories return with disturbing clarity, collapsing past and present into a single moment. The crowd's flinch is therefore layered, carrying not just fear of what may happen now, but the accumulated terror of what has happened before. The crowd had been bracing for revenge in the abstract, but the footsteps make that expectation tangible. Anticipation becomes immediacy. There is no longer time to imagine alternatives or hope for mercy. The sound feels like confirmation that the feared sequence has begun. The people listening do not know who the footsteps belong to, but in their experience, identity matters less than function. Authority, once set in motion, rarely changes course. The rhythm of the steps creates a strange tension. They do not accelerate, suggesting urgency, nor do they falter, suggesting uncertainty. This controlled pace communicates confidence, and confidence in wartime power structures is often synonymous with impunity. The crowd interprets this as a sign that whatever is about to happen has already been decided elsewhere. The footsteps are not searching, they are arriving. As the sound grows closer, the crowd's internal calculations intensify. Individuals begin to assess their own vulnerability. Some wonder if they will be recognized, remembered, or accused. Others fear proximity itself, that being too close to the front or too visible could draw attention. Parents subtly shift their children behind them. Friends edge closer together, not to resist, but to avoid isolation. These small movements ripple through the crowd, but no one dares to break formation entirely. The flinch is followed by stillness, as if movement itself might provoke the approaching force. Silence becomes a form of self-defense. Even whispered words feel dangerous, capable of drawing focus. The crowd understands, consciously or not, that in moments like this, being noticed is a liability. The safest position is invisibility, even when escape is impossible. The footsteps continue, each one reinforcing the power imbalance. The crowd is stationary, passive, defined by waiting. The unseen figure or figures approaching are active, directional, shaping the moment through motion alone. This contrast deepens the sense of helplessness. Waiting becomes its own form of suffering, extending fear over time rather than releasing it in a single violent act. There is also anger beneath the fear, though it remains carefully suppressed. Some in the crowd resent their own reaction, the way their bodies betray them by flinching. They are aware that this reflex grants power to the approaching authority before any action is taken. Yet resisting the reaction feels impossible. Fear has been conditioned too deeply, reinforced by too many consequences. The body's instinct to survive overrides the mind's desire for dignity. The footsteps begin to slow, or perhaps the crowd's perception of time stretches so far that every interval feels exaggerated. This deceleration intensifies the tension. If violence were coming immediately, it might already have happened. The delay introduces a new layer of uncertainty. The crowd, having braced for impact, finds itself suspended in a prolonged moment of expectation. Fear shifts from sharp to heavy, pressing down rather than striking. In this suspended state, imagination becomes cruel. People envision possible outcomes, each one shaped by personal experience. Public humiliation. A warning delivered with force. Even those who tell themselves not to imagine cannot stop. The mind fills the silence left by the absence of visible action. The footsteps, now very close, seem to echo inside the chest as much as on the ground. Yet something begins to feel subtly wrong, or at least unfamiliar. The footsteps do not trigger immediate commands. There is no shouted order to disperse, no abrupt interruption of the crowd's stillness. This absence is confusing. The crowd had prepared for confrontation, not ambiguity. The lack of immediate aggression creates a strange dissonance, unsettling precisely because it deviates from expectation. This uncertainty does not bring relief. Instead, it deepens the freeze. When patterns break, people struggle to adapt. The crowd's fear, trained to respond to predictable cruelty, hesitates when that cruelty does not appear on schedule. The footsteps, once a clear signal of danger, now raise questions the crowd is not equipped to answer. Are they being observed? Assessed? Tested? As the sound finally reaches its nearest point, the crowd holds its breath collectively, waiting for the next cue. The flinch that began with the first step has evolved into a full bodily suspension, a moment where action feels impossible in any direction. Whatever comes next will either confirm everything they fear or force them to confront the unsettling possibility that their expectations, shaped by war and suffering, may no longer fully explain the reality unfolding before them. What emerges in the wake of the footsteps is not the eruption the crowd has been conditioned to expect, but a presence defined by restraint. The authority that now reveals itself does so without raised voices or abrupt gestures. British calm settles over the space like a deliberate choice rather than an accident, a posture shaped by discipline and confidence rather than hesitation. This composure does not soften the moment. Instead, it reframes it, forcing the crowd to recalibrate their understanding of what power looks like when it is not performing rage. The calm is immediately noticeable because it contradicts the emotional rhythm the crowd has been following. Wartime experience has taught them that authority often arrives loudly, asserting itself through shock and intimidation. Here, however, there is no rush to dominate the senses. Movements are economical. Posture is upright but unthreatening. The absence of visible aggression feels intentional, as though violence is being withheld rather than avoided. This distinction matters, and the crowd senses it instinctively. British calm carries with it an implication of control that does not rely on spectacle. It suggests that force, if needed, is already assured and therefore does not need to be advertised. This is unsettling in a different way. Anger can be anticipated, even endured. Calm implies calculation. It suggests that outcomes are being managed rather than improvised. The crowd, used to reading danger in emotional excess, struggles to interpret this quieter form of authority. The silence that accompanies this calm is not empty. It is structured, purposeful. Each pause feels measured, each second allowed to stretch just long enough to assert dominance over the tempo of the moment. The crowd realizes that they are no longer simply waiting for something to happen, they are being made to wait. Time itself has become a tool, reinforcing the imbalance between those who act and those who endure. This restraint forces the crowd inward. Without the release of immediate violence, fear has nowhere to go. It cannot resolve into action or even resignation. Instead, it circulates, turning into uncertainty. People begin to question their assumptions, not because those assumptions were irrational, but because the present moment refuses to confirm them. The expected narrative of revenge stalls, leaving behind a space filled with doubt. British calm also carries moral weight, whether intended or not. By refusing immediate retaliation, authority appears, at least superficially, to occupy a higher ground. This perception complicates the crowd's emotional response. It becomes harder to frame the moment as a simple confrontation between oppressor and victim. The restraint suggests fairness, or at least the appearance of it, and that suggestion unsettles those who have relied on moral clarity to make sense of suffering. Yet this calm does not erase history. The crowd's memories of past actions remain vivid, and restraint now does not undo brutality then. Instead, the contrast highlights the complexity of power. Authority is revealed not as a single behavior but as a spectrum of tactics. Violence and calm are not opposites. They are complementary tools, deployed according to circumstance. The crowd begins to sense that this restraint may be just as strategic as any act of force. There is also an implicit challenge embedded in this calm. By not acting violently, authority removes the crowd's expected role as victims of immediate retribution. The people gathered must now confront their own reactions, their own expectations. Fear, once justified by visible threat, now feels exposed. The crowd becomes aware of how deeply conditioned they are, how quickly they assume the worst, and how powerless they feel when their assumptions are not validated. This realization is uncomfortable. Some feel a flicker of relief, quickly suppressed by suspicion. Others feel embarrassment at their own flinch, even though it was entirely rational. A few feel anger, not at the authority present, but at the psychological manipulation implicit in restraint. Calm, in this context, feels like a mirror held up to the crowd's fear, reflecting it back without comment. The authority's composure also reinforces hierarchy. Calm is a luxury afforded to those in control. It signals that there is no urgency, no threat to the authority's position. The crowd understands this intuitively. Their own tension contrasts sharply with the composed presence before them, highlighting the imbalance of power more effectively than any show of force could. Calm becomes a demonstration of dominance precisely because it does not need to prove itself. As the moment extends, the crowd begins to freeze, not just physically but emotionally. The absence of clear cues leaves them suspended. They cannot protest without provocation, nor can they relax without reassurance. This emotional paralysis serves authority well. A frozen crowd is compliant by default, unable to organize or react. The calm thus functions as containment, holding the situation in a state of controlled uncertainty. The moral reversal hinted at in this moment begins to take shape. The crowd had expected revenge and prepared to endure it. Instead, they are confronted with restraint that demands interpretation rather than endurance. This shift forces a re-evaluation of what justice, authority, and resistance look like under occupation or control. The simplicity of fear gives way to complexity, and complexity is harder to navigate. British calm also reshapes responsibility. Without overt violence, the burden of reaction shifts subtly toward the crowd. Any escalation now would appear to originate from them, not from authority. This dynamic places the crowd in a precarious position, where restraint on one side increases the stakes of action on the other. The people gathered sense this, even if they cannot articulate it fully. In this way, calm becomes a form of pressure rather than release. It tightens the situation without visibly compressing it. The crowd's freeze is not the result of intimidation alone, but of cognitive overload. Too many interpretations compete at once. Is this mercy? Strategy? Surveillance? A test? Each possibility carries different implications, and the inability to choose one keeps the crowd immobilized. As the seconds pass, the calm begins to feel heavier than the anticipated violence ever did. Violence, however terrifying, would have confirmed expectations and allowed fear to resolve into memory. Calm prolongs the present, stretching uncertainty into something almost unbearable. The crowd realizes that they are experiencing a different kind of power, one that operates not through fear of pain, but through control of perception. By the end of this extended moment, nothing outwardly dramatic has occurred, yet everything has shifted. The crowd is no longer merely bracing for revenge. They are caught in a psychological confrontation that offers no clear enemy and no clear outcome. British calm has transformed the space from a site of expected punishment into a stage of moral ambiguity, where fear, authority, and restraint intersect in ways that leave the crowd frozen, uncertain, and profoundly unsettled. The stillness that settles after the realization of restraint is deeper than the one that came before. It is no longer simply the absence of noise or movement, but a collective suspension, as though the crowd has been caught between breaths. Bodies remain rigid, not because of an immediate threat, but because motion now feels conceptually risky. The crowd freezes, not in fear alone, but in confusion, as the emotional script they have prepared no longer applies. The expected rhythm of cause and effect has broken down, leaving them unsure how to exist within the moment. This freeze is not dramatic. There are no visible gestures of surrender or defiance. Instead, it manifests in micro-adjustments, feet rooted more firmly to the ground, eyes fixed forward or deliberately lowered, hands stilled where moments ago they trembled. The crowd becomes a study in containment. Every instinct urges reaction, yet reaction feels dangerous without clarity. The result is a paralysis that feels heavier than panic, because it is sustained by uncertainty rather than shock. In this suspended state, the crowd becomes acutely aware of itself. Individuals feel the presence of others more intensely than before, sensing shared tension without shared understanding. No one speaks, not because speech is forbidden, but because it feels inappropriate, even hazardous. Words might collapse the fragile equilibrium. Silence becomes a mutual agreement, an unspoken contract to endure the moment without drawing attention to oneself or others. The freeze exposes how deeply power has penetrated the psyche. The crowd is not being physically restrained, yet they remain immobile. Authority no longer needs to enforce stillness. Anticipation and doubt do that work more efficiently. This realization is unsettling, even humiliating for some. The people gathered sense that they are participating in their own containment, held in place by the invisible weight of expectation rather than visible force. As time stretches, reflection begins to intrude. Without immediate danger to respond to, thoughts turn inward. People replay their assumptions, their fears, the way they flinched at the sound of footsteps. Some feel shame, not because their fear was unjustified, but because it now feels exposed. Others feel resentment, suspecting that this restraint is a calculated display meant to unsettle them more effectively than violence ever could. The freeze becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting back emotions that had been buried beneath the urgency of survival. This moment also forces a reconsideration of moral boundaries. The crowd had prepared to endure revenge, framing themselves clearly as victims of an unjust response. Now, without overt punishment, that clarity blurs. Restraint complicates the narrative. It introduces the uncomfortable possibility that authority may be acting within a framework of rules or principles, however selectively applied. This does not erase past wrongs, but it disrupts the simplicity of moral alignment the crowd had relied on. The absence of immediate violence creates a vacuum where interpretation rushes in. Some begin to wonder if this restraint is temporary, merely a prelude to something worse. Others consider whether it signals a shift in policy or strategy. A few, cautiously, allow themselves to imagine that the feared revenge may not come at all. These competing interpretations coexist uneasily, preventing any collective emotional response from forming. The freeze also reveals generational differences within the crowd. Older individuals who have seen cycles of power rise and fall recognize restraint as a familiar tactic, often preceding negotiation or reorganization. Younger ones, whose experiences are shaped by more recent and chaotic violence, struggle more with the ambiguity. For them, calm feels unnatural, almost deceptive. This divergence in perception further fragments the crowd's internal unity. Authority, by remaining calm, has shifted the burden of meaning onto the crowd. The people gathered must now decide what this moment represents, even as they lack the information to do so confidently. This transfer of interpretive responsibility is itself an exercise of power. By refusing to define the situation through action, authority forces the crowd to define it internally, amplifying anxiety and self-doubt. The freeze becomes symbolic as well as physical. It represents a pause in the familiar logic of wartime life, where actions are usually followed by swift and brutal consequences. Here, consequence is delayed, and delay becomes its own form of control. The crowd senses that whatever comes next will be shaped by how they behave now, even if they do not know what behavior is expected. This awareness increases the pressure to remain perfectly still, perfectly compliant. In this immobility, the crowd confronts the erosion of agency that prolonged conflict brings. They realize how little room they feel they have to act freely, even in the absence of direct coercion. The freeze is not just about this moment. It reflects years of adaptation to unpredictable authority. People have learned that stillness often feels safer than initiative, even when initiative might change outcomes. Emotionally, the freeze is exhausting. Maintaining tension without release drains energy and resolve. Fear that cannot discharge into action becomes heavy, pressing inward. Some feel a dull ache of hopelessness, others a quiet anger simmering beneath restraint. Yet these emotions remain private, unexpressed, trapped behind neutral expressions. The crowd's outward calm masks a complex and turbulent inner landscape. The longer the stillness lasts, the more it reshapes the meaning of the gathering itself. What began as a moment of expected punishment becomes a test of endurance and perception. The crowd is no longer simply waiting to be acted upon. They are being observed, whether literally or metaphorically, in how they respond to uncertainty. This realization heightens self-consciousness, reinforcing the freeze even further. In this way, restraint proves to be a powerful form of domination. It denies the crowd the clarity of opposition and replaces it with ambiguity that weakens collective resolve. Without a clear injustice unfolding before them, it becomes harder to justify resistance, even internally. The moral certainty that often fuels defiance is diluted, replaced by hesitation and doubt. As the moment continues, the freeze settles into something almost ritualistic. The crowd holds itself in a state of controlled stillness, waiting for a signal that may or may not come. This ritual does not require instruction. It has been learned through repetition and survival. The people gathered understand, at a deep level, that in times like these, movement can be misread, emotion can be exploited, and silence can be the safest response. By freezing, the crowd acknowledges a shift in the nature of power confronting them. Authority is no longer merely something that strikes. It is something that watches, waits, and shapes behavior through implication rather than force. This recognition is deeply unsettling, because it suggests that even in moments without violence, control remains intact. The freeze, then, is not simply a reaction to calm, but an adaptation to a new configuration of power. The crowd stands suspended between fear and understanding, between expectation and reality. In that suspension, they experience one of the most profound effects of war, the transformation of ordinary human presence into something cautious, constrained, and perpetually uncertain. Memory begins to press forward once the tension settles into something sustained rather than explosive. With no immediate action to occupy their fear, the crowd drifts inward, pulled toward recollection. The present moment, stripped of violence yet heavy with implication, becomes a surface onto which the past projects itself. Old scenes replay uninvited, earlier gatherings broken by gunfire, warnings delivered through destruction, lessons taught through loss. These memories do not arrive as complete narratives but as fragments, sounds, expressions, absences, that stitch themselves into the current stillness. For many, this recollection is involuntary. The mind, deprived of new stimuli, returns to what it knows best. Years of war have trained memory to function as both warning and defense. People remember what happened the last time authority appeared calm, or the last time it was not. They recall how restraint once gave way to sudden force, how mercy was sometimes delayed rather than denied. These recollections do not bring clarity, they complicate it. Each remembered outcome suggests a different interpretation of the present, none of them reassuring. The contrast between past brutality and present restraint creates a dissonance that is difficult to reconcile. The crowd has learned to expect continuity in behavior, especially from those in power. When that continuity breaks, it forces a painful reassessment. Some struggle to accept that authority can choose not to retaliate immediately. Others suspect that this calm is merely strategic, a pause designed to increase its eventual impact. The inability to determine which interpretation is correct keeps the emotional wound open. History weighs heavily here, not as an abstract timeline but as lived experience. The crowd has seen how narratives are rewritten after the fact, how moments of restraint are later cited as evidence of fairness, even when followed by harsh consequences. This awareness breeds skepticism. Calm in the present does not erase violence in the past, and the crowd knows that restraint can coexist with domination. The past refuses to be quiet, insisting on its relevance even as the present resists easy classification. As memories surface, so do questions about responsibility and guilt. Some individuals begin to wonder whether their expectation of revenge reflects something about themselves as much as about authority. Have they internalized a logic of punishment so deeply that they now assume it is universal? This line of thought is unsettling, because it suggests that fear has not only constrained behavior but reshaped moral expectations. The crowd must confront the possibility that war has altered how they understand justice itself. The recollection of past injustices also revives anger, though it remains muted. This anger is not directed solely outward. It turns inward as well, questioning why so much suffering has failed to produce clarity or resolution. The restraint unfolding now feels almost accusatory in that context, as though asking the crowd to acknowledge complexity when all they want is recognition of harm. The past demands acknowledgement, yet the present offers ambiguity instead. There is also grief embedded in these memories, grief for those who are no longer present to witness this moment. The crowd remembers people who once stood where they stand now, who faced similar uncertainty and did not survive it. This remembrance deepens the emotional weight of restraint. Calm feels unjust not because it is cruel, but because it arrives too late to matter for those already lost. The past casts a shadow that restraint cannot dispel. The contrast between expectation and reality forces a reassessment of power dynamics. Violence once made authority legible, even if brutal. Calm makes it opaque. The crowd begins to understand that domination does not require constant aggression. It can adapt, refine itself, and operate through psychological means. This realization is disturbing because it suggests that even moments of apparent moderation are part of a larger system that remains intact. As the past and present collide, the crowd becomes aware of how narratives are formed. They recognize that this moment, whatever its outcome, will eventually be remembered and interpreted, perhaps even used to justify future actions. Restraint may later be cited as evidence of moral high ground, regardless of what follows. This awareness sharpens the crowd's sense of vulnerability, not just physically but historically. They fear being written into a story they cannot control. Some individuals begin to question whether resistance itself has been misunderstood. If authority can exercise power without immediate violence, what does defiance look like? The familiar equation of resistance with reaction no longer applies. This uncertainty weakens the emotional foundation of opposition, making it harder to imagine effective action. The past, once a source of lessons, now feels ambiguous, offering warnings without guidance. The crowd's reassessment is uneven and fragmented. Different memories lead to different conclusions. Some see restraint as an opening, however narrow, for change. Others see it as a trap, a way to lull communities into compliance before tightening control again. These divergent interpretations remain internal, unspoken, because the stillness of the moment discourages expression. The crowd shares space, but not understanding. This inward turn intensifies isolation. Even surrounded by others, individuals feel alone with their thoughts. The collective fear that once unified them now fractures into private reckonings. The past, experienced differently by each person, resists consolidation into a single narrative. Authority, by remaining silent and calm, allows this fragmentation to deepen, weakening the possibility of shared response. The weight of history also brings fatigue. The crowd is tired of interpreting, tired of guessing, tired of carrying memory forward into every new moment. Restraint demands patience, but patience has been worn thin by years of uncertainty. This exhaustion does not erupt into protest. Instead, it settles quietly, reducing the capacity for hope or outrage. The crowd endures not because it believes, but because it no longer knows how not to. As the moment stretches on, the past continues to shape perception in subtle ways. Every gesture is compared to remembered ones. Every silence is measured against earlier silences. The crowd cannot encounter the present on its own terms because the past insists on being consulted. This dependence on memory reinforces the sense that time has collapsed, that war has trapped them in a loop where moments repeat without resolution. In this collision of memory and restraint, the crowd confronts one of the most painful consequences of prolonged conflict: the loss of interpretive freedom. They can no longer experience events as isolated or new. Everything is filtered through what came before. Calm is not simply calm, it is calm after violence, calm after loss, calm after betrayal. The past transforms even mercy into something suspect. Yet despite this burden, the reassessment continues, unavoidable and unresolved. The crowd cannot return to pure expectation of revenge, nor can it fully accept restraint as benign. They are suspended between what they have lived through and what they are now witnessing. In that suspension, the moral landscape shifts again, becoming less certain, more complex, and more deeply troubling than the simple fear they first carried. The moment begins to loosen not because something decisive happens, but because the human body cannot remain frozen indefinitely. Subtle shifts occur, barely noticeable, as tension redistributes rather than disappears. The crowd does not relax, it recalibrates. Fear no longer spikes sharply, nor does it vanish. Instead, it settles into something more diffuse and enduring, a quiet awareness that whatever just transpired has altered the internal balance of understanding. The absence of revenge, so loudly anticipated, leaves behind a residue more complex than relief. What lingers most is the realization that expectations have been disrupted. The crowd had prepared for pain, humiliation, or loss, and that preparation had provided a grim form of certainty. When that certainty dissolves, it leaves confusion in its place. People are left holding emotions that no longer align neatly with the situation. Relief feels premature. Gratitude feels inappropriate. Suspicion feels necessary but exhausting. The crowd carries all of these at once, unsure which will prove most useful. This unresolved ending forces a deeper reckoning with power itself. The crowd begins to understand that authority has not withdrawn. It has simply chosen a different posture. Calm has not reduced control, only altered its expression. The realization is sobering. Violence would have been easier to process, easier to condemn. Restraint requires interpretation, and interpretation places a burden on those who must live with uncertainty. The crowd senses that they have not escaped domination, only encountered a more refined version of it. In this awareness, a quiet moral inversion takes place. The crowd had assumed that cruelty was the clearest indicator of injustice. Now they are confronted with a situation in which injustice, if present, is harder to name. Calm authority appears reasonable on the surface, even disciplined. It resists simple condemnation. This complicates the internal narratives that sustain endurance and resistance. When oppression no longer announces itself loudly, it becomes more difficult to oppose without doubt. The psychological impact of this shift extends beyond the immediate gathering. Individuals begin to imagine how this moment will follow them into the future. They will remember not what happened, but what did not. That absence will shape their expectations the next time authority appears. Some will flinch again, instinctively. Others may hesitate, uncertain whether fear is still warranted. Either way, the memory of restraint becomes another layer in the accumulation of experience, altering how threat is perceived. The crowd also senses that this moment will be interpreted differently depending on who tells the story. To those in power, restraint may be remembered as professionalism, as proof of order and fairness. To those who stood frozen, it may be remembered as manipulation, as a reminder that control does not require violence to be effective. This divergence in interpretation deepens the sense of imbalance. The same moment can validate authority while unsettling those subject to it. As people begin to disengage from the immediacy of the scene, they do so cautiously. There is no clear signal that the moment has ended. The lack of closure keeps emotions taut. People move carefully, speak softly, avoid drawing attention. The crowd disperses not with relief but with vigilance, aware that restraint can be temporary and that consequences may still arrive later, detached from this specific moment. This cautious withdrawal reinforces a sobering lesson. Uncertainty can be more controlling than fear. Fear provokes reaction. Uncertainty prolongs compliance. The crowd recognizes, perhaps without fully articulating it, that they have been shaped by this encounter. Their behavior has been adjusted without force. Calm has achieved what violence might not have, a lasting imprint on perception. In the aftermath, private conversations will attempt to assign meaning to what occurred. Some will argue that restraint indicates limits, that authority is constrained by rules or scrutiny. Others will insist it was merely strategic, a performance designed to maintain order without drawing attention. These debates will remain unresolved, because the moment itself offered no definitive answers. Ambiguity becomes its own legacy.